Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. That whole empty nest thing, it's a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, yeah.
You spend so much time and energy raising your kids, and then all of a sudden, poof, the house is quiet.
Yeah.
It can be easy to feel a little bit lost
Mm-hmm.
and lonely.
For sure.
And that is exactly what we're going to be diving into today.
Okay.
We found this really interesting podcast episode that tackles all the emotional ups and downs of the empty nest, but then it also gives some really solid advice on how to deal with all those feelings, and especially loneliness.
It's so interesting how this episode actually goes beyond, just acknowledging the sadness and grief that can come up with this change.
Right.
And like you said, he dives into how this phase of life can be an opportunity for growth and rediscovery,
Yeah.
especially in the context of the LPot community's work on loneliness.
Okay, so let's start with the emotional side of things. I mean, it's got to be a mix of everything, right? Like excitement for your kids, but maybe also a little bit of sadness, even a bit of like anxiety about what's next.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. The source material actually lists a bunch of different emotions that are totally normal to be feeling. Sadness, grief, loneliness, those are some of the big ones.
Uh-huh.
But then you might also be feeling a sense of relief, a sense of freedom, maybe even like a little excitement to have more time for yourself. It really is a roller coaster.
Yeah, it's like a whole chapter's closing and you're not quite sure what the next one holds,
Right.
which is where the LPot community comes in, encouraging folks to see this loneliness as like a signal, a call to action.
Exactly. They're really emphasizing that loneliness isn't some kind of personal failing,
Right.
but it's more like a natural human experience. And more importantly, like you said, a chance for growth.
And this podcast episode that we're looking at actually echoes that sentiment.
Yeah.
It talks about this idea of refining purposes,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds pretty empowering, right? It's not just like wallowing, but actually taking the time to figure out what you want out of this next stage of life.
Right. And the thing that really stands out in the podcast is that it's not just about like big ambitions or making huge changes in your life. It could be about finding those old passions again, sure, but it can also be about finding like joy and meaning in the everyday things.
So it could be as big as like finally writing that novel you've always dreamed up,
Right.
or it could be as simple as reconnecting with nature, or finally taking that pottery class you've been putting off.
Exactly. Or even finding fulfillment in strengthening those relationships you already have or building new ones, which again really ties in with what the LPOT community is doing around loneliness.
I love that. It's like taking all that love and care that you've poured into your kids and channeling it back towards yourself and your own personal growth,
Yeah.
which could look like connecting with others in a whole new way.
And the episode gets into how to actually do that.
Okay?
Talking about things like reconnecting with old friends, finding new social circles, maybe even joining a book club or a hiking group. They even talk about how powerful online communities can be for people who are maybe geographically isolated or just prefer connecting virtually.
I've heard amazing things about online communities,
Yeah.
especially for people who share like specific interests.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine finding a whole group of folks that are as passionate about bird watching as you are, or 18th century poetry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But let's be real, putting yourself out there can be scary. What if you've kind of been out of the social loop for a while?
Right.
The source material acknowledges that, right?
It does, and it actually offers some pretty practical advice for dealing with that fear.
Okay.
One thing that really stuck out was the suggestion to start small. So instead of like jumping headfirst into some big social gathering, maybe try reaching out to one or two old friends. Or join a smaller online group
Yeah,
where you can kind of ease your way back into interacting.
that's a great point. Like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in the pool.
Right.
Baby steps. But what about the deeper stuff, the science behind why loneliness hits us so hard?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not just like a fleeting feeling. It can feel really heavy, almost physical.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. And that's actually where the podcast delves into some neuroscience.
Ooh, I love when things get brainy. Tell me more.
So it turns out there's this part of our brain called the anterior cingulate cortex.
Okay.
And this area is linked to both physical and emotional pain.
Wait, really? So loneliness is actually processed in the same part of the brain as like a stubbed toe or a headache?
Exactly. And the theory is that this connection comes from way back from our evolutionary history.
Okay.
Like way back when being part of a group was literally essential for survival.
Uh-huh.
So our brains developed this way of interpreting social isolation as a threat,
Okay.
triggering a stress response that feels pretty much the same as physical pain.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. So it's not just in our heads, it's literally in our brains. No wonder it can feel so awful sometimes.
Right.
So if loneliness is this, like, deeply ingrained survival mechanism, what can we really do about it? Because knowing the science is cool and all,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't just magically make the feeling disappear.
Right. The key is recognizing that loneliness is this signal, a call to action,
Yeah.
to start building those meaningful connections that our brains are craving.
Okay.
And the good news is this podcast, much like the LPot community, has some solid advice on how to actually do that.
All right, well, let's get into that advice because I think we could all use a little help in that department sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially when we're going through something like a big life transition, like an empty nest.
One of the things that this podcast really emphasizes, and it aligns with the LPot community's mission, is that combating loneliness is about more than just being around people.
Okay.
It's about having genuine and fulfilling connections.
Right, because you can be in a room full of people and still feel totally alone.
Exactly. It's quality over quantity when it comes to relationships. And that's really where these practical tips come in.
Yeah.
They're not just about packing your schedule with social events, but
Uh-huh.
being more intentional with the types of connections that you're building.
So what are some of those tips? I'm all ears, especially if they can help with those, first few awkward steps back into socializing.
Well, remember how we were talking about starting small?
Yeah.
The podcast suggests just reaching out to one person, maybe an old friend you haven't spoken to in a while, or a family member you want to get closer to.
Okay.
Just a quick phone call, a text, or email, it can be that easy.
That's a relief. Sometimes it feels like you need to be a social butterfly to get back out there, but reaching out to just one person feels a lot easier.
Exactly. And, even if that one conversation doesn't turn into like a huge rekindled friendship,
Right.
it's still a step towards dealing with that feeling of isolation.
Okay.
And it might even inspire you to reach out to someone else.
It's like building momentum, right? Like one small connection can lead to another and another.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you've got this whole support network.
Exactly. And those connections can really come from anywhere. The podcast also talks about, finding your tribe.
Finding your tribe, I like that. So it's about finding those places where you belong, right? Where you can connect with other people who share your interests or values.
Absolutely. That could be joining a local book club or a hiking group, volunteering for a cause you care about.
Mm-hmm.
Taking a class in something you've always wanted to learn. The key is to just get out there and explore different ways to connect.
It's funny how this whole finding your tribe thing really fits in with the LPot community's message, too.
It does.
They're all about creating spaces where people can come together and fight loneliness.
Exactly. What I find so inspiring about their work is that they get that loneliness can affect anybody.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how old you are, your background, your social status. So they've created this really inclusive and supportive place where people can come together and talk about their experiences and find resources and just feel less alone.
I think that's so important, especially now when it can be so easy to feel disconnected. It's like they're creating a bridge between people who might otherwise feel isolated.
Exactly. And it's not just about online connection either.
Okay.
They really encourage people to get involved in their own communities, to volunteer, go to events, really put themselves out there and build those face-to-face relationships that are so vital.
It's awesome that they have this multifaceted approach because there's no one-size-fits-all answer to loneliness, right? What works for one person may not work for another.
Right, and that's why it's so important to have like a bunch of different tools to use.
Yeah.
Some days you might want to connect online, and some days you'll be craving that in-person interaction.
Right.
The important thing is to listen to yourself and just try different things until you find what works for you.
And this podcast episode actually encourages that experimentation too. Trying new things, stepping outside your comfort zone, and being open to making connections in unexpected places.
Mm-hmm. And it also highlights how important it is to take care of yourself.
Oh yeah, self-care is so key.
Because putting yourself out there can be draining, especially if you're already feeling kind of vulnerable.
So it's important to balance those social efforts with, inner reflection and self-care.
Right.
Whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's a hot bath or a good book, or just spending time in nature.
It's about recharging your batteries so that they can really be present when you're interacting with others.
We've covered so much already, from the science of loneliness to those practical ways to build connections and take care of ourselves. But there's this one piece we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the role of purpose in dealing with loneliness. It's something that comes up in both the LPot community and this podcast.
That's a great point. That's actually where the podcast takes a really interesting turn.
Okay.
It suggests that finding your purpose isn't just about adding things to your to-do list, but it's more about connecting to something bigger than yourself.
Connecting to something bigger than yourself, that sounds almost spiritual.
Right. And it's not necessarily about religion or anything like that. It's more about finding something that gives your life meaning.
Okay.
Something that makes you feel like you're a part of something larger.
So that could be anything from volunteering to working on a creative project to just focusing on being the best version of yourself.
Exactly. And when you find something that really lights you up, it's like it automatically draws in other people who feel the same way.
It's like a magnet for connection.
Exactly. And those connections, those shared passions and values, those can be super powerful in fighting loneliness.
So it sounds like the key to dealing with loneliness in the empty nest, and really any time in life, is a multifaceted approach. Understanding the science, being intentional about building connections, taking care of ourselves, and finding that sense of purpose that connects us to something bigger.
I think you said that perfectly, and it's such an empowering message for anyone who might be feeling lost or alone.
Yeah.
Because it reminds us that we can create a fulfilling life.
Right.
Even when things change around us.
I love that. So where do we go from here? How do we actually take all this great advice and put it into practice, especially if we're in the middle of that empty nest transition?
Well, I think the first step is just acknowledging how you feel.
Okay.
Don't judge yourself for feeling lonely.
Right.
It's a normal reaction to a big change.
It's about letting ourselves feel our feelings.
Exactly. And then once you've done that, it's time to take action. Start small. Try different things and be patient with yourself. It takes time to build meaningful connections.
And don't forget the self-care.
Of course, because when you feel good about yourself, you're more likely to build healthy relationships with others.
This has been such an insightful and encouraging conversation.
It has.
But I feel like there's still so much to explore. Like, how do we define our purpose? And what are some actual steps we can take right now to start building those connections?
These are great questions. And luckily, we've got one more part of this deep dive to get into all that.
Awesome.
So stick with us.
Welcome back to the show. Before the break, we were talking about connecting with something bigger than ourselves as a way to fight that feeling of loneliness. It sounds kind of abstract, though, right? Like, where do you even start with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, there isn't just one right answer.
Okay.
This podcast that we've been talking about and the LPot community both really emphasize that purpose can look different for everyone. It's not like there's one big mission you have to find. It's more about finding what gives you a sense of meaning.
Right.
What makes you feel fulfilled.
Okay.
And that can be a lot of different things.
So like maybe it's about finding an old passion again, like picking up a paintbrush, or maybe it's about devoting yourself to some cause that you believe in.
Exactly. It could also be about making your relationship stronger or focusing on your own personal growth or even just finding little moments of joy in your everyday life.
Yeah.
It's all about trying different things and seeing what feels right for you.
So give yourself permission to experiment and just see what happens.
Right. The podcast actually suggests a cool exercise to help you figure out what might give you that sense of purpose.
Okay, what is it?
They say, think back to a time in your life when you felt really alive and engaged, like you were really in the zone and feeling good.
I like that. It's like looking back at your own life for clues.
Exactly. So you remember those moments and you ask yourself, what made them so special? What were you actually doing? Who were you with? What were your values at that time?
That's a really powerful exercise.
Yeah.
Like you're rediscovering those core parts of yourself that brought you joy.
Right. And then the challenge is figuring out how to bring those things into your life now.
Okay.
Even if it's a little different than it was before.
So like if you used to love teaching, but you don't want to go back to a classroom full time, maybe you could volunteer to tutor kids or teach a workshop at your local community center or something.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to express those passions in a way that works for you right now.
And the cool thing is that when you do that, you naturally connect with people who are into the same things.
Right. Think about it. You join a book club and suddenly you're surrounded by people who love to read.
Yeah.
You volunteer at an animal shelter and you're with other people who care about animals.
It's like purpose is this magnet that draws people in. And that's a great way to fight loneliness.
It is. And it really reinforces what the LPot community is all about. It's about getting out there and making those connections.
Yeah,
Putting yourself out there and getting involved with the world around you.
I love that. It's so empowering. It's like a reminder that we're not just stuck with loneliness. We can actually choose to create a life that feels more connected.
Absolutely. And it's never too late to start.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're just getting to the empty nest stage
Yeah.
or if you've been feeling lonely for a while. There's always a chance to connect with yourself and with other people.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's this loneliness is a signal, not a life sentence. It's a reminder to check in with yourself, to reach out to other people,
Yeah.
to find what gives you meaning.
I love that.
And if we can do that, if we can work on those connections and find our sense of purpose,
Mm-hmm.
we can build a life that feels really rich and fulfilling and not lonely at all.
Beautifully said. And just a reminder to everyone out there, you're not alone in this. The LPot community is a fantastic resource
It is.
for finding support and connection and inspiration. And there are tons of other groups out there, both online and offline,
Yeah.
that would love to have you. So take that first step. Explore your passions, stay connected with your loved ones, and never give up on finding those connections that makes life worth living.
And as you go, we'll leave you with one last thing to think about. Think about those times when you felt truly connected and happy. What were you doing? Who were you with? And how can you bring those things into your life today, even if it looks a little different than it used to?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into loneliness and the empty nest. We hope you learned something new and that you feel inspired to build a life full of connection and purpose. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.